I'm in Aberdeenshire enjoying a dram of peated whiskey, because that ingredient, peat, is on the front line of our battle against climate change. We'll be telling you what it is and why this key component of the water of life could be under threat. So good. Welcome to the Climate Show with me, Tom Heap, and this week we're all about peat, something that should be our ally in the fight against climate change, but all too often is becoming an enemy. Now, you can't see it, but it's surrounding me here beneath my feet. It's made up largely of this, sphagnum moss, which dwells in this kind of wet marsh, and over centuries it gets compressed and squeezed down and turns into something pretty solid like that. The problem is this stuff is so useful and is very widely commercially exploited. From the smoky flavour of famous peated whiskies to much of our most fertile farmland, the compost you use in your garden or allotment, and even the deliberate burning of heather on peatlands for shooting grouse. This is peat, the compressed remains of marshland plants. It's a great soil for crops, a great compost for garden plants, and this lot is going off to flavour whisky. But there's so much concern about its climate impact, the governments are thinking of banning its use, not least here in Scotland. Peat covers roughly 1/10 of the UK and 1/5 of Scotland. It is our biggest natural carbon store, holding more than the combined forests of the UK, France and Germany. It should look something like this, the exotically named red moss of Balerno, just outside Edinburgh.
Peat is essentially preserved moss, and it's this moss which is sphagnum moss. And we've got an accumulation here of thousands of years of sphagnum moss that's got this amazing ability to retain water.
The problem is that it's proved so useful away from the bog. We grow food with it, make drink with it, even heat some homes with it. But now we know the best thing for us is to leave it well alone.
It should be left in the ground because it's a store of carbon. When it's damaged and degraded, it releases carbon into the atmosphere.
But 4/5 of Scotland's peat is degraded to some degree. Here it's being dug and dried for fuel. The moment it's exposed to the air, the key carbon lock is broken. When natural things like trees or leaves rot, decompose, that's when they give off their carbon into the atmosphere. And this shows you how it doesn't really happen in peat. This log here is reckoned to be about 3,000 years old. It's been down there that long without decomposing, until recently when it became exposed to the atmosphere. That's the same problem with peat. It's now turning into carbon dioxide. 1/3 of the peat from here is brought to warm homes. The rest, including this load, goes to dry malted barley for whisky.
So the business has been going since 1905. It's a family-owned business. We're now in the 4th generation.
And how much do you take from here?
It's about 6,000 tonnes a year that we produce. 3,000 for malting and 3,000 for fuel.
And sales for domestic heating have been brisk since the war in Ukraine made gas and electricity so expensive. But it does have an outsized climate impact for each snug house. In terms of climate change, is this not a bit like cutting down the rainforest?
It's an awful lot smaller scale than cutting down the rainforest. There's 2 million hectares of peat in Scotland, and we're harvesting from 80 hectares. So it's an absolutely minute area that we're actually harvesting from. So rainforest sounds like total destruction. I don't think that's what we're doing here.
Whisky is Scotland's biggest export and employs around 11,000 people, especially in rural areas. Peat kilns are vital for many brands for that much-loved peaty reek.
So we've now got our peated wort from the mash tun, Tom, about 60,000 litres, and we're now going to ferment it with yeast into a peated beer. It'll take about 3 days, and then it'll be ready to distill.
It's just sensory overload in this place. The sight, the smell, there's like a magical mystery to it for the nose.
You want to step up here.
There are 4 stages to making whiskey: malting, mashing, fermentation, and finally distillation.
This is where the magic happens, the still house.
Oh, you're keeping me in suspense. This distillery makes nearly 700,000 bottles of Ardmore and provides the fingerprint malt ingredient for 1.5 million more.
For our brands and many others, peat is fundamentally important. It creates that unique character and flavour that our consumers love.
So how would a peat ban affect the business?
It would have a unique and detrimental impact on what is really our flag-waving, standard-bearing export. Scotch whisky is such a hugely important export, not just to Scotland, but to the UK as a whole.
But here the whisky industry are funding the restoration of peat bog. The water from this one feeds the distillery below. It's all about the wet.
Watch yourself. Yes, there's plenty of water around.
This bog had been drained and invaded by trees.
So the point of this generally is to actually hold more water here so the sphagnum can actually grow, because what we're looking for is actual sphagnum growth. The sphagnum is one of the main things which makes peat. And so by keeping a consistent water table here, that's what the conditions that sphagnum needs to grow.
Re-wetting like this spreads out the moss and allows the peat to build up, adding about 1 millimetre per year. That could have a big impact if widespread.
Working with businesses, there's a bigger opportunity because the government alone can't do this, and it's really important that all businesses that use peat, but also businesses that in some way are using the natural environment, give something back.
Does what we've seen out there on the peat bog, does it in effect offset the damage that you're doing elsewhere?
Yeah, we tend not to use the word offset. What we're looking to do is we replenish what we've removed.
Why is it you don't like offset?
There's a lot of connotations about things like greenwashing, people saying things that are maybe not quite as robust. But as I say, there's lots of benefits to peatland restoration. There's all the things about carbon sequestration, stopping the emissions of carbon from degraded peatlands. We're not even talking carbon, we're just purely putting back more sphagnum moss to replenish the peat that we take out.
Whisky is responsible for less than 1% of peat extraction in Scotland, but that extraction remains an industrial cause of climate change. Should its iconic status get it off the hook? So is a peaty dram safe in the Scottish Government's hands? Well, I'm going to have a word with them about that and other uses of peat, and I'm joined by Mari McCallan, who's the Scottish Environment Minister. Mari, why do you think it's so important to tackle peat hard?
Well, because we're living in a climate and nature emergency, and the Scottish Government has responded to that. Scotland's got some really stretching climate targets to be net zero by 2045, to get there via a just transition. And peat is a really important nature-based solution as we seek to build that just transition.
Well, let's look at some of those different sectors. Let's start with gardening. What's your plan there?
I've recently launched a consultation. I want industry, horticulture industry, to respond. I want them to tell me about the timescales over which they think they can stop this. Well,
England's been very clear on its timescale. It says no gardening use by 2024. Your own Royal Botanical Garden in Edinburgh has said gardening use needs to be seriously challenged. You need to get in and put a date in there, don't you, to show you're serious?
I need to do that once I'm in receipt of views from people who'll be affected by it. So, I want to make policy. That's what a just transition's about. It's about taking people with you. So I'm asking all of the questions about the outcomes and the timescales, and then we will consider all of that and we'll set the date. But my objective is ending the sale, retail first, and professional thereafter, and then considering other sales.
What about whisky? Should we continue to use peat for making whisky?
Well, I think we need to be proportionate. So we need to recognise going into this that the vast majority of uses of peat is for horticulture, and that's why that's right front and centre of the consultation. Comparatively, whisky is a very small percentage. So I'm seeking their views about how it will, any progression in this regard would affect them. I'm also speaking to the Scottish whisky industry. I know that they are mindful of their use of peat, and I know that they want to, for example, do things like make sure that they're restoring and absolutely getting maximum efficiency out of their uses of it.
But what do you think yourself? Do you think you want to see peat continued in whisky, or do you want to see it ended?
Whisky is a really important part of Scotland's culture and our economy. The decisions that I take will be informed by the consultation, but if I can give you one example, we've just passed a seminal piece of planning legislation in Scotland, National Planning Framework 4, and it took a very hard line on the commercial extraction of peat, saying it won't happen and there won't be allowance for any extension. But there was an exemption to that, which was for the Scottish whisky industry, where it could be demonstrated that they were restoring it.
It seems to me that a ban on peat and whisky is vanishingly unlikely. Am I right?
It's about proportionality, and it's about recognising that the percentage of peat extracted for the use of whisky is comparatively very small.
What about cutting and selling for burning, for keeping people warm in their homes?
Yeah, so that needs to be considered. It's a very culturally important issue, particularly in island communities, and I have a question in my consultation which specifically asks about that, again, so that I can harness as much information as I can and make the fairest and most just decision.
So will peat be banned from the hearths of Scotland?
The question is it sold? That's the first question we're asking.
Okay, so will it be banned for sale for the hearths of Scotland?
That'll be informed by the consultation. I certainly want to take people's views on that.
Well, as you heard from Mari, the Scottish Government is looking to ban peat for gardeners, but is reluctant to put a date on it. In England, they've said 2024. Let's have a look at Wales, where Stephanie Hafferty has been offering advice on social media on how you garden without peat.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Hafferty and I grow as much food as I can year round on my homestead of about ½ an acre here on a hillside in West Wales. And everything I grow, from the smallest seedling to trees in pots, all of it is grown using peat-free compost. I'm an organic gardener. I grow with the environment and wildlife in mind. That's as important to me as producing as much food as I can. It would be really crazy to do things to help wildlife and then buy compost which harms wildlife and our planet. Peat is an incredible carbon catcher. Millions of tons of carbon are stored in our peat bogs, and when you dig a peat bog to extract the peat, that carbon is released in the environment. I'm here at Carscarron Peat Bog near Tregarron. It's one of the largest raised peat bogs in the UK. Even though it looks quite bleak in the winter time, coming to a landscape like this really makes you realise the importance of keeping peat in the ground. The peat should be here for all of nature and everyone to enjoy, and also for the vital role it plays in our environment and the health of our planet.
Stephanie Hafferty with some gardening tips. And one thing I've noticed near me is it's often difficult to tell in the garden centres which is the peat-free compost and which is the peated. Labelling clarity could definitely be improved. Now, much of the peatland in England is in the Pennines, where at this time of year, gamekeepers are often burning off the heather because those are lands managed for shooting, and the young grouse like to nibble on young heather buds. Many conservationists say this damages peat, but some of the moorland managers say if done correctly, it's good for nature and doesn't harm the peat.
Hi, I'm Luke Steele and I'm the Executive Director of Wild Moors. We're campaigning to restore the upland habitats and peatlands which this grouse moor is currently sat on. Now, grouse moors bring with them huge environmental costs, particularly for peatlands which they sit on. The peat moors are regularly burnt to drive through the younger, fresher heather shoots for red grouse to eat. The idea being the more heather there is, the more grouse are available to be shot for sports when the season arrives in August. But this brings with it many problems. It heavily degrades the peatlands, meaning that they turn from massive carbon stores into carbon emitters. And we've already recorded over 600 fires on moorlands like this one across northern England alone.
We're all agreed that keeping carbon locked in the soil is paramount. The latest research shows that in the medium to long term, careful vegetation burning is actually good for capturing carbon in the soil. The fire service and government say burning vegetation, not peat, can be an essential tool when done carefully by trained and skilled individuals. It's useful for both conservation and helping to control devastating wildfires that take out vast areas of moorland and release frightening amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
We're also calling for that partial ban to be extended to shallow peatlands, which are the most heavily degraded peatlands, which urgently need our attention to restore them back to that healthier, fitter state.
Now, after the break, we'll learn why the National Grid has been spending hundreds of millions of pounds switching off wind turbines, and we'll hear why this barrister has been evading police up a tree in Northamptonshire. Welcome back to the show, and as you can see, I'm joined by our climate and energy correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter. Hannah, you've been looking at wind today, and particularly what happens when the wind blows hard.
Yeah, we talk a lot about what happens when the wind doesn't blow. We had to burn fossil fuels to fill the gap. But actually, we've got a bit of a problem at the moment in the UK when there's too much wind. All of those turbines up in the north, in Scotland and the North Sea, they essentially produce too much electricity for our grid to be able to handle. And so there's a real bottleneck in the transmission systems between Scotland and England. And what the National Grid has to do, it's got no choice. It has to call up those wind farms and say, please turn off your turbines. And here's actually quite a lot of money for doing so. Last year it was about 200 million quid.
Now, the logic of that seems a bit perplexing at first, but I guess the turbine people say, look, we could be making money. The wind is blowing. We could be spinning here, and it's you that's telling us we're not allowed to send it away, so you have to compensate.
That's basically it. So we pay, in the first instance, to the wind turbines to guarantee the amount of electricity they pledged to give us.
Right.
Then we pay them to turn it off when they're doing too much electricity for our cables to handle. And then, here's the rub, we pay again to gas power stations nearer to the source of demand, often in the south of the country, to turn on to fill the gap, because we still need that power. So it's all about the necessity of upgrading the grid, and the renewables industry has been saying for a long time now, we've got to do more.
Is this a sort of unfair advantage for renewables, that they get lots of bill payers' money or taxpayers' money to do this?
Well, bill payers do pay for all of this. It gets passed on directly to us. Once the National Grid has shelled out the cash in the first instance up front, it then goes on to our bills in the form of network costs. And we know that the National Grid has already said, actually it's probably going to get worse as we get more and more wind power before the infrastructure, which is planned, comes on stream later in the decade.
But are these kind of payments unique to renewables?
No. The National Grid pays all kinds of generators to ramp up and down, fossil fuels included, but obviously there's been a focus on wind because it is such a critical part of our clean power system. We're supposed to be decarbonised in terms of power generation by 2035.
Now, a few weeks ago, we looked at the issue of energy storage, which, as I understand it, helps to address this problem, because if you can store more of that excess energy, you're less likely to melt the wires and you can use it later on. So batteries and other storage helps.
Such a critical part of solving this issue. The UK's making leaps, arguably not fast enough. The renewables industry has said we need to go much further, much faster, if we're going to provide these 50 gigawatts of wind power by the end of the decade.
Insofar as there's a fault here, is the fault with the wind turbines, the people generating the electricity, or with the grid?
This is not about wind being bad. You know, wind in the UK is a success story, and it's an increasingly important part of our clean power generation future. This is about, frankly, the rest of the country, the infrastructure, the storage capacity, green hydrogen production even, keeping up with what's happening in terms of wind generation.
There's been some news this week as well from the government predicting a bright new future, a cheap new future for electricity.
Yeah, Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for the newly created Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, DESNS, although apparently we're not allowed to say that because it sounds like a sneeze. He's been saying we want the UK to have the cheapest wholesale electricity prices in Europe by 2035, and we're going to do that by massively ramping up renewables and nuclear. So it's that combination, that's the kind of green future we're galloping towards, according to the new Secretary of State.
Galloping for 12 years off, that's not so much jam tomorrow, is it? Jam in quite a few years. Just a quick one, it's been a very, very dry February. Is this going to have implications possibly later in the year?
Well, we know it is the driest February for 30 years or so. Reservoirs just not filling up, and we could find ourselves back in Cornwall talking about drought emergencies again.
We could be on those dry lake beds once again. Hannah, thank you very much indeed. Now, barrister Paul Polsland went viral on social media this week after he evaded police and climbed an old lime tree in Wellingborough. We caught up with him to ask why he did it.
All of these trees are protected by a Tree Preservation Order, TPO, because they are an incredible heritage asset. You know, they're one of the longest avenues of lime trees in the country. They're over 100 years old. They're really beautiful. They're one of the key features of the town. 60 trees at risk. I think about 20 have been taken so far. Ordinarily, to fell a tree with a TPO on it would be a criminal offence. Nobody, the council or the developer, has shown to local people that the necessary parts of establishing the exemption actually apply in this case. And I began offering advice and eventually wrote the legal advice on Sunday night. And when that didn't have any effect on the developer or the council, I decided to go down to the site to try and speak to the developer and the police myself.
Unless an exemption applies, chopping down these trees is not lawful.
Spoke to the protesters, worked out what was going on and what the kind of reasoning of the developer was, as far as I could tell. In that instance, I was faced with a choice. I could either just kowtow to what I thought was the police's wrong interpretation of the law, or I could take peaceful, positive action right there and then to do something. And that's why I climbed into the tree. I didn't plan to. I didn't have any food or water or particularly warm clothing with me. And then I stayed there until I think 7 in the evening, by which point I was getting seriously cold. But luckily the felling had stopped for that day. So I was under arrest throughout all of yesterday, but they couldn't put me into custody because I was up a tree. It's quite funny. And then eventually I made an agreement with them that if I came down and they didn't take me to the police station, then I would come down. I don't think I'm guilty of anything. They've also given me a hilarious bail condition that I'm not allowed to climb any tree in Northamptonshire. It's really important that local tree protectors get to see those plans and say, well, and to question, given the importance of these trees to local people, I don't think that's unreasonable.
Unsurprisingly, this has caused an almighty row, with the developer, Stanton Cross, telling us that it is acting fully within the law, that the planning permission overrides the preservation order on the trees, and that the development will include the planting of hundreds of new trees. That's North Northamptonshire Council's view as well. Now, before we go, just a reminder that you can catch the Daily Climate Show at 3:30 p.m. on weekdays on Sky News. And you can get all the latest climate and environmental news on the Sky News website or app by scanning the QR code on your screen right now. But that's it from this week here in Scotland. We'll be back next week, assuming I don't take up residence as a bog dweller. See you then.